There are people who walk into a room convinced the whole world was born to kneel at their feet. They never imagine that sometimes the very person they crush beneath their heel is the fragile thread holding their entire empire from crumbling into ash. That night, the grand hall of the Ravenwood Hotel in Chicago glowed like a gilded dream. Crystal chandeliers spilled their light across the polished marble floor, illuminating every silk gown, every glass of champagne shimmering in the hands of the 200 most powerful people in the city. And, in the middle of that glittering world, a young woman in a plain uniform was quietly bending down, rearranging the garments behind the stage. "Get this piece of trash out of here before it stains our whole evening." Priscilla Vandermeer's voice, cold as ice, cut through the music. Her diamond-laden hand seized the girl's shoulder and shoved her backward. Sienna Westcott stumbled, and the swan-shaped brooch, the only keepsake her late mother had left behind, flew from her chest and fell to the marble. Letting out a soft, aching little sound, Bryce raised his phone, the lens aimed straight at the girl's pale face, his lips curling into the kind of smile only those who have never tasted humiliation can wear. The entire room turned, the onlookers 200 stares, and dozens of phones lifted into the air like a forest of cold eyes waiting to watch a human being, stripped of her dignity. Sienna knelt, her trembling hands searching for the brooch amid the pool of light, and the giggles spreading outward like ripples. And from the far end of the room, another woman in a server's uniform set down her tray with a sharp clatter, then parted the crowd, and stepped forward not knowing that those very footsteps were carrying her toward a destiny that had waited 6 long years. Subscribe to our channel, so together we can welcome more stories of dignity, compassion, and the quiet power of a good heart. The laughter was still spreading like poisonous ripples when the serving woman knelt down beside Sienna. Her name was Della Hayes, 27 years old, her face marked by sleepless nights, yet her eyes were strangely calm. She didn't look at the elite guests surrounding them. She didn't look at the screens pointed their way. She only bent over the cold marble floor, letting her calloused fingers search for the swan brooch lying amid the pooled light. When she found it, she gently brushed an invisible layer of dust from the silver swan's wing, then placed it softly into the trembling palm of the young woman. "Stand up, sweetheart," she said quietly, her voice warm as a hand laid upon a shoulder in the middle of winter. "Don't kneel before people who aren't worthy of having you kneel." Sienna looked up, her reddened eyes fixed on the strange woman who had just shielded her, and in that moment, she saw something no one in that glittering room possessed: kindness. Della helped the girl to her feet, wrapping an arm around Sienna's shaking shoulders, placing herself between the young woman and those cruel stares like a fragile but unwavering wall. That single gesture was what made Priscilla Vandermeer stop short. The most powerful woman in Chicago was used to having every word she spoke become an order, used to seeing heads bow wherever her gaze swept. And yet now, right in the middle of her own party, a servant dared to stand with her back straight, dared to reach out and protect the very thing she had just called trash. "A maid," Priscilla said, each word dripping down like drops of acid. "A food-serving maid dares to lecture me about who deserves what." She stepped forward, her high heels striking the stone floor in sharp, cold beats, and the circle of the crowd automatically widened to make room for the new performance. "Do you know where you're standing, girl? This isn't some cheap diner where you wipe tables for a living. This is Ravenwood, where even a single chair is worth more than your entire year's wages." Della didn't step back. She only tightened her arm gently around Sienna's shoulders, and when she spoke, her voice didn't tremble. "I know exactly where I'm standing, Mom. I'm standing in a room full of people dressed in expensive clothes, watching a young woman get shoved to the floor, without a single one of them reaching out a hand." Those words fell into the crowd, like a stone thrown onto the surface of a still lake. A few murmurs rose, a few faces turned away, and for the first time that evening, something almost like shame flickered across one corner of the room. But Priscilla wasn't ashamed. She only felt challenged, and for a woman like her, being challenged in front of the whole upper circle was unforgivable. Bryce, her son, immediately swung his phone camera away from Sienna and toward Della, grinning as if he had just struck gold. "Everybody," he called out to the crowd watching online, "we've got ourselves a heroine now, a serving heroine." The laughter broke out again, this time pouring toward Della. The phone snapped toward her, and 200 pairs of eyes now fixed on the woman in the faded serving uniform. Priscilla folded her arms across her chest, her lips curving into a triumphant smile, because she was certain she had just found herself a new prey, one even lower, even more vulnerable, and therefore even easier to crush. She had no idea that the woman standing before her, the serving woman she had just decided to turn into entertainment, was the fragile thread connecting the fate of the entire Vandermeer family to a name that would make all of them turn pale tonight. And Della. She only drew Sienna closer to her side in silence, and inside her, amid the storm of mocking laughter, a single thought rose, that she had endured things far worse than this, and she wouldn't let that young girl collapse alone. Bryce's phone screen blazed with numbers leaping wildly, from 3,000 viewers to 7,000, then 12,000 in only a few short minutes. He held the phone high as if raising a victory flag, circling Della to capture every angle while talking non-stop to the thousands of people glued to their screens. "Look at this, everybody. Now this is real entertainment," he said. "A maid playing knight in the heart of Ravenwood. Can you believe it?" Comments surged like floodwater in the corner of the screen. Some people sending laughing icons, others typing cruel little lines, each one eager to add a word to the spectacle unfolding before them. And the crowd in the hall was no less vicious than that virtual world. A middle-aged man in a tailored suit took a sip of wine, tilted his head slightly toward the woman beside him, and dropped a remark just loud enough for Della to hear. "I truly don't understand how the organizers hire people, letting someone who doesn't know her place slip in here like this." The woman answered with a soft giggle, her diamond-ringed fingers half covering her lips, her eyes sweeping over Della from her worn serving shoes to her neatly tied hair, as though she were appraising some cheap object mistakenly displayed inside a luxury boutique. Another group of young women gathered near the marble column, filming while whispering among themselves with words that only the look in their eyes was enough to reveal as poisonous. That entire glittering room, hung with paintings worth fortunes and filled with the most expensive champagne in the city, had in that moment turned into a pack of wolves draped in silk and finery, all of them catching the scent of vulnerable prey and tightening the circle together. And yet, in the heart of that storm, Della remained still. She didn't argue back. She didn't explain herself. She didn't let a single tear fall and give that crowd the satisfaction it wanted. She only stood there, back straight, chin slightly lifted, hands resting at her sides with calm restraint, and that very stillness became the thing that made many people in the room more uneasy than any words of defiance could have. Because people could laugh at someone who wept and begged, but it was far harder to laugh at someone who stood quietly and endured with her dignity intact. Della could feel Sienna pressed close behind her, the girl's hand lightly clutching the edge of her uniform, trembling like a leaf before a hard wind. She reached one hand behind her, gently took that ice-cold hand, and gave it a light squeeze, a silent gesture saying that she was still here, that the girl wasn't alone. "Don't listen to what they say," Della whispered softly, without turning her head, her eyes still fixed straight ahead. "Their words only reflect their own souls. They don't say anything about you." Sienna swallowed her tears, nodded ever so slightly, and for the first time since the swan brooch had fallen onto the stone floor, she felt she could straighten her back a little. The number on Bryce's phone screen had reached 20,000, then 25,000, and he grew more and more excited, putting on an even more ridiculous performance to please his invisible audience. But there was one thing Bryce, the laughing crowd, and all those dancing numbers didn't know. They thought they were recording the sight of a lowly woman being cornered for their amusement. They had no idea that every frame they were so greedily capturing tonight, every mocking word they were throwing out with such satisfaction, would one day become undeniable evidence of their own downfall. And amid that forest of cruel stares, Della still quietly shielded the girl behind her, steady as a lonely lighthouse standing against the roaring storm around it. Just when the laughter was reaching its peak, while Bryce was still absorbed in showing off the 25,000 views to his invisible crowd, another sound of heels rang out across the marble floor, slow, decisive, entirely different from Priscilla's smug rhythm moments earlier. The crowd parted on its own, and from behind those silk-draped backs an older woman stepped forward. It was Eleanor Whitfield, the veteran fashion critic whom no one in all of Chicago dared to dismiss, the woman whose single line of commentary could make or destroy an entire designer's career. She had been standing at the edge of the crowd all this time, watching in silence, and now her face was covered in a layer of frost colder than even Priscilla's voice. She didn't look at Della, nor did she look at Sienna. Instead, her knife-sharp gaze swept once around the room, over the screens held aloft, the half-emptied wine glasses, the faces still carrying traces of laughter that hadn't yet faded. 200 people, Eleanor said, her voice not loud, but so clear that every word struck everyone's ears like a hammer blow. 200 grown people standing here, watching a young woman get shoved to the floor, and the only thing any of you could think to do was raise your phones and record it. That brief sentence fell, and the entire room suddenly sank into a strange silence. No one laughed anymore. A few devices slowly lowered. A few eyes began to avoid one another, as though for the first time that evening, they were truly seeing their own reflections in the mirror the old woman had just held up before them. The middle-aged man who had spoken so cruelly moments before quietly set his wineglass down on the table, his shoulders sagging slightly. The group of young women by the stone column stopped whispering, their diamond-ringed fingers withdrawing from their phone screens. The smug, gleeful atmosphere that had been so thick in the hall, only moments earlier now began to crack, and through those cracks slipped a feeling this upper circle rarely had to taste: shame. Della lifted her head slightly and looked at the older woman, a quiet glimmer of gratitude passing through her eyes, while Sienna tightened her grip on the swan brooch in her palm, as though she had just found a patch of solid ground in the middle of a flood. But that shift, however fragile, only made Priscilla feel the ground beneath her feet beginning to tremble, and for someone accustomed to standing at the height of power, nothing was more terrifying than losing control in front of a crowd. Eleanor, Priscilla laughed, a strained laugh meant to sound dismissive. I didn't expect a woman as refined as you to defend people who don't even know where they are. This is an evening for the elite, not a place for cheap moral preaching. She swept a hand toward Della and Sienna, her voice rising another notch to drown out the silence threatening to swallow her authority. I've said it already, and I'll say it again. These two don't belong here, and I won't let them ruin the evening I worked so hard to prepare. The more she spoke, the more hurried and aggressive Priscilla's voice became, because deep down, she fully understood that the crowd that had stood with her only moments ago was beginning to waver, and the only way she knew to hold on to power was to grip it tighter, press harder, and speak louder. Eleanor merely curved her lips faintly, not bothering to answer, her eyes saying everything for her, that she had seen straight through the woman standing before her. And while Priscilla was still raising her voice, to salvage what remained of her dignity, high above in the Ravenwood Hotel, behind the door of a private ceremonial suite, another thread of that night's destiny was beginning to pull tight, just one floor above the humiliation unfolding in the main hall, behind the thick oak door of the private stateroom on the top floor of the Ravenwood Hotel. Roland Vandermeer was pacing back and forth like an animal trapped in a cage. He had shed the usual composure of a tycoon, his silk tie loosened, his forehead dotted with sweat, even though the room was kept at a perfectly cool temperature. On the long ebony table in the center of the room lay the thick file for the merger deal into which he had wagered his entire career, a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars that could lift the Vandermeer empire to a new height, or send it plunging into the abyss if tonight didn't go smoothly. He's 15 minutes late, Roland muttered, glancing at the gold watch on his wrist for what felt like the 100th time. The assistant stood close to the door, his hands clasped together, unable to hide his tension. Sir, his people said he'll come down and sign himself when he feels it's appropriate, he answered quietly, not when we feel it's appropriate. Roland stopped at once, turning to look at the assistant with eyes filled with anger and a flicker of fear he tried to conceal. In Roland Vandermeer's entire business life, no one had ever dared to make him wait like this. No one had ever forced him to lower himself this far. But the man he was waiting for tonight wasn't an ordinary partner. It was Damon Westcott. The assistant spoke that name softly, almost in a whisper, as though saying it too loudly would be enough to invite disaster. In Chicago's underground financial world, the name Damon Westcott was mentioned with a kind of wary dread. People spoke of him in lowered voices, in hidden corners, the way people spoke of a force one shouldn't touch. Rumor had it that those who had betrayed him had vanished from the business world without a trace, that a single phone call from him was enough to bring a corporation crashing down overnight, that behind that cold and courteous exterior was a mind that never forgot a debt of gratitude and never forgave an act of betrayal. Roland had been forced to call in countless connections and trade away, more than he cared to admit, just to earn the chance to sit at the negotiating table with that man. He knew perfectly well that if this deal succeeded, the Vandermeer family would step into a new era. But he knew just as clearly that if anything displeased Damon Westcott, even the smallest thing, then everything he had spent his life building would vanish like smoke. He clenched his hand, trying to reassure himself. His wife, Priscilla, was downstairs in the hall receiving the guests. Everything had been prepared perfectly. Not a single mistake could happen on a night this important. "Go downstairs and see how Priscilla is doing," Roland said to the assistant, his voice trying to sound calm. "Tell her to keep everything smooth. Tonight, there absolutely mustn't be any trouble." The assistant nodded and hurried away, leaving Roland alone with the file and the unease gnawing inside his chest. He had no idea that at that very moment, one floor below, the wife he had just instructed to keep everything smooth was lighting the fuse to the very trouble that could burn it all to the ground, and that the powerful man he was anxiously waiting for a reason no one in the Vandermeer family could possibly imagine, was about to arrive at the grand hall much earlier than planned. Back in the main hall, the silence Eleanor Whitfield had just created was threatening to spread, and Priscilla Vandermeer understood perfectly that if she allowed that silence to last even one more minute, she would lose forever the control she had spent her entire life so carefully building. So she did what people accustomed to power always do. When they feel that power begin to shake, she swung it harder. She turned sharply and snapped her fingers toward the two security guards in black suits standing near the entrance, the crisp snap of someone who had never once had to wonder whether her orders would be obeyed. "Security," Priscilla called out, and this time her voice was no longer a mocking hiss, but the cold tone of a command that couldn't be refused. "I want these two people out of here immediately." The two security guards looked at each other, hesitating for a moment, because even they could now sense that something was wrong with the way everything was unfolding. But in the end, the uniform and the paycheck won. They slowly walked toward Della and Sienna. Priscilla stood with her arms folded, watching them, her lips curving back into that familiar look of triumph, because to her, this was the proper order of the world. In Priscilla Vandermeer's world, some people were born to give orders, and others were born to bow their heads, and the two standing there, a serving maid and a little helper girl, obviously belonged to the second kind, people so low they seemed harmless, people she could crush without having to worry about any consequence at all. It was that absolute belief that blinded her, that kept her from pausing for even a second to ask herself why the serving woman was so calm, why there was no fear in her eyes, the kind of fear people usually showed when they had been driven into a corner. "You don't need to touch us," Della said, her voice still calm as the surface of a lake at dawn. "We'll leave on our own." She gently slipped an arm around Sienna's shoulders, preparing to lead the girl away from that cruel circle, because she understood that sometimes keeping one's dignity didn't mean staying to fight, but knowing how to walk away with one's head still held high. But Priscilla, who had never known what enough meant, refused to grant them even the right to leave in peace. "No, not that quickly," she said, stepping across their path, her eyes flashing with the poisonous light of someone who wanted to savor every last drop of the feeling of trampling another human being. "I want this entire room to see the two of you thrown out like you deserve, so that next time, people like you will understand that there are places where you're never allowed to set foot." Bryce immediately lifted his phone again, muttering to the online crowd that the best part was about to happen, while the well-dressed guests held their breath and waited, some with a sick eagerness, others with a growing unease inside their chests. Sienna looked up at Della, her lips trembling as if she wanted to say something, a secret on the verge of bursting from her throat, a name that could end all of this at once. But Della only shook her head faintly, giving the girl's hand a gentle squeeze as if to say there was no need to lower herself and beg anyone, and just like that, beneath hundreds of stares, and all those phones pointed at them, the two women walked toward the door with their backs straight, not knowing that destiny was about to pull them back within a hair's breadth. The two women hadn't yet crossed the distance to the door, when a phone rang from inside Sienna's uniform pocket, bright and jarringly out of place in the air, stretched tight as a drawn wire. The girl stopped short, her face changing color, and hurriedly shoved her hand into her pocket to silence it. But in the instant she pulled the phone out, the screen lit up right before the eyes of the people standing closest, and across it appeared a name written in large letters. It was Damon. Sienna rejected the call so quickly, it was as if the screen were burning hot in her hand, then shoved the phone back into her pocket, but it was already too late. A woman nearby, the same one who had been speaking so cruelly earlier, immediately let out a mocking laugh. "Damon, is it?" she said, her voice full of scorn. "How elegant that sounds. Or has this little girl even invented an imaginary rich boyfriend just to comfort herself?" The laughter broke out again, this time mixed with a fresh flavor of contempt, because to that crowd, the fact that a poor little helper girl had received a call and then hurried to shut it off, as though hiding something, only proved what they had been so sure of from the beginning, that she was an intruder, a liar trying to cover up who she really was. Priscilla curled her lip, her eyes even more triumphant. "See," she said loudly for the whole room to hear, "even a phone call has to be hidden in secret. Exactly the sort of unclean thing I expected." Sienna lowered her head, her cheeks burning with humiliation, because she couldn't tell them who had called. She couldn't let the secret she had protected for so many months burst out in this place, not in this degrading way. Della glanced at the girl, a quiet understanding passing through her eyes, even though she didn't know what the name Damon meant, even though she had no idea that the name was the very thread connecting everything happening that night. And then, as if fate wanted to weave one more knot into the net tightening around the two of them, Della's own phone began to vibrate in her pocket. She almost meant to ignore it, to simply lead Sienna away from this cruel place, but when she glanced down at the screen, her whole body suddenly went rigid. On it wasn't a name, but 3 short words that made her heart constrict. St. Mercy Hospital. Della's hand, the one wrapped around Sienna's shoulders, trembled slightly, and for the first time since she had stepped into that circle, a crack appeared in the calm mask on her face. She quickly pressed the phone to her ear, turning a little as if trying to find some small shred of privacy in the middle of the crowd, her voice dropping low and urgent. "Hello, I'm listening," she said, and on the other end of the line, a voice sounded that instantly brought tears to her eyes. The crowd around her was still laughing over Sienna's call, still waiting to watch the expulsion Priscilla had promised, and not a single person noticed that the resilient serving woman, who had stood like stone only moments earlier, was now gripping her phone so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. 2 calls, 2 names, 2 fates that seemed to have nothing to do with each other, all ringing out in the same moment, inside Ravenwood's glittering hall. And no one in that crowd, not Priscilla in her triumph, not Bryce greedily recording with his phone, could possibly imagine that both of those calls were quietly pulling taut the strings of destiny that would soon tighten around them all. The voice on the other end of the line said that her mother's condition was getting worse, and the news closed around Della's chest like an invisible hand, pulling her mind away from this glittering hall and carrying it back to a rainy night 6 years earlier, the night that had determined the entire course of her life afterward. Back then, Della was only 21. Still a girl full of fire working the night shift at a small diner on the corner of a quiet Chicago street, where pale yellow light spilled through the steam-fogged window panes, and the last customers had been gone for a long time. That night, the rain came down in sheets, each drop thrashing against the tin roof with a harsh rattling sound, and when Della carried the trash bag out to the alley behind the diner, she nearly stepped on a figure collapsed against the damp brick wall. It was a man, his large body now crumpled onto the ground like a tree struck down by a storm, his clothes soaked through and torn, his breathing ragged and heavy. In the faint light of the alley lamp flickering between brightness and shadow, Della couldn't make out his face, only that he was badly wounded and so exhausted he could no longer force himself to rise. A sensible girl would have turned away, would have called someone and left it at that, because that dark alley and a stranger in such a state promised nothing but trouble. But Della wasn't the kind of person who could turn her back on another human being in pain, because her father, who had passed away, had always taught her while he was alive that kindness must never be measured by whether the person receiving it deserved it or not. So she knelt beside him in the rain, wrapped her arms around that heavy body, and helped him into the warm little kitchen behind the diner. She dried him with clean towels, used the diner's old first aid kit to bandage the wounds on his body in a clumsy but devoted way, then warmed a bowl of soup and patiently fed him spoonful by spoonful when he was still too weak to hold it himself. The man barely spoke, only opening his eyes now and then to look at her through heavy lashes, his gaze carrying something Della would only understand much later, the astonishment of a man who had gone too long without anyone treating him kindly, without asking for anything in return. Near dawn, when he was finally able to struggle into a sitting position, he tried to tell her in a hoarse voice that he had to leave at once, that there were people hunting him, and he couldn't stay here another minute, or he would drag her into danger. Della didn't ask who he was. She didn't ask what he was running from, because she understood that some questions were best left unspoken. She only took the little wages she had just received that night and pressed them into his hand so he would have something to use while escaping. Then, as if afraid even that wasn't enough, she reached up to her neck and removed the silver necklace, with the teardrop pendant her father had left her before he died, the most precious keepsake she owned and the only thing she still had of him, and placed it in the palm of that stranger's hand. "Take it," she said softly. "If you get desperate enough, you can pawn it. A human life is worth more than an object anyway." The man looked at the necklace in his hand, then looked at her, his lips moving as though he wanted to say something, but in the end, he didn't. He only tightened his fist around that keepsake, as if gripping a silent promise, then nodded to her very slowly before disappearing into the last veil of rain before morning. Della stood silently by the doorway and watched him until that tall shadow vanished completely, never knowing that she had just saved a man who would change her entire life, and never imagining that the small act of kindness she had offered on that rainy night was about to make her pay a price so heartbreaking it would steal the breath from her lungs. That price came for her the very next morning, faster and more brutally than anything she could have imagined. When the diner owner opened the cash box at the start of the day and discovered that the money inside was short compared with the books, his face darkened, and his suspicious gaze immediately turned toward the girl who had worked the night shift before. Della stood there, facing his questions, and she understood that she couldn't tell the truth, couldn't explain where the money had gone without dragging the man who was running for his life into danger. So she chose silence, and her silence was taken as a confession. The owner fired her that very morning, without a goodbye, without the slightest trace of loyalty for all the months she had worked so diligently. And worse than that, he wrote into her record the one reason that would make any place hesitate when they looked at it later. Suspicion of financial dishonesty. That invisible stain clung to Della like a shadow that never left, following her everywhere she went to apply for work. She submitted applications from one place to another, and each time someone turned to that part of her background, she saw the look in their eyes change, from initial warmth to caution, then to cold distance, and the final answer was always the same, that they were very sorry, but the position had already been filled by someone else. Just like that, one door after another closed in front of her, and the passionate 21-year-old girl she had once been was slowly worn down by life, slipping from decent work into more unstable jobs, then into temporary work that was barely enough to survive from one day to the next. She had washed dishes for hire in sweltering kitchens, cleaned offices at midnight when the whole city had fallen asleep, accepted any shift people called her for no matter how pitiful the pay was. The little diner where she had once worked, the place that had witnessed both her kindness and her injustice, closed not long afterward and was transferred to a new owner. The old sign was taken down, and with it, every trace of the girl who had once worked the night shift there vanished without anything left behind, as if that fateful rainy night had never existed, as if the man she had saved had never passed through her life. Everything was reduced to a memory that only she carried, and what made all those years of hardship more heartbreaking than anything else was that Della had never once regretted what she had done. There had been nights when she lay in her cramped rented room, listening to the sound of car horns drifting up from the street below, and wondered what had become of the man from that night, whether he had escaped the people chasing him, whether her father's necklace had helped him in some way. She didn't know his name, hadn't clearly seen his face, had no way of finding him again, and had never thought there would come a day when she would meet him once more. To Della, it had simply been the right thing to do, an act of kindness given without expecting anything in return, even though that kindness had taken almost everything from her. Now, 6 years later, standing in Ravenwood's glittering hall, with the phone still pressed to her ear, and the terrible news about her mother echoing through it, that woman once again faced the contradiction that had followed her all her life, that sometimes the kindest people were the very ones made to bear the greatest losses, and that this world was rarely fair to those who dared to give without calculation. Because if there was one single reason, Della gritted her teeth and endured every insult tonight without running away, without collapsing, that reason was lying in a hospital bed at St. Mercy Hospital, where her frail mother was fighting a grave illness day by day. Margaret Hayes, the woman who had raised Della alone after her father passed away, was now only a fragile shadow swallowed by white blankets, her skin pale, her thin hands covered in raised blue veins. The illness had drained her strength little by little, and the hospital bills kept piling up, growing thicker every week, turning into an enormous weight pressing down on Della's shoulders, which had already been far too small for so much burden. It was because of those bills that she worked 2 shifts a day, working until she almost had no time left to sleep, her exhausted feet dragging her from a morning shift at a cafe to an evening shift serving parties at places like Ravenwood, where she had to put on a uniform and smile while serving people who treated her as if she were invisible. She accepted every tip with gratitude, gathering each small amount, because every dollar she earned was another little brick in the wall she was trying to build to protect her mother. There had been nights after work when, though she was so worn out she wanted only to collapse and sleep, Della still caught the last bus to the hospital, sat beside her mother's bed beneath the soft, dim light, held that bony hand, and told her cheerful stories she had made up herself, hiding away all the hardship and humiliation she had suffered out there. Margaret, though illness had made her memory come and go, still always recognized her daughter whenever Della stepped into the room, and her cloudy eyes would brighten with a warmth no sickness could ever put out. "My daughter," she often whispered, "you're working too hard. I only wish I could get well again so I could help you." And each time, Della had to turn her face away to quickly hide her tears, then smile and answer that her mother shouldn't worry, that she was perfectly fine, and that all her mother needed to do was rest and get stronger. She had never told her mother about the stained record, about the doors that had slammed shut in her face years ago, about the price she had paid for doing one kind thing on a rainy night, because she didn't want her already weak mother to carry even one more burden. In Della's heart, her mother was everything she had left in this world, the last thread connecting her to the small family she had once had, and she was willing to endure anything, bow her head before anyone, do any job at all, as long as she could keep that fragile flame burning for one more day. That was exactly why tonight, as she stood inside the circle of powerful people trampling on her dignity, she still didn't fight back, didn't let her anger sweep her away, because she knew that if she caused trouble, if she lost this job, the person who would suffer the consequences wouldn't be her, but the mother lying there waiting for every dollar of hospital payment. And now, as the voice from the hospital told her that her mother's condition was worsening, as she stood there with the phone pressed to her ear, amid the crowd's mocking laughter, Della's heart felt as though it were being torn in two, one half wanting to rush instantly to her mother's bedside, the other half understanding that she was still trapped inside this glittering prison, helpless and utterly alone. Della ended the call, drew in a deep breath to push down the panic rising in her chest, and when she turned back, she found Sienna looking at her with worried eyes. "Are you all right?" the girl asked softly, her voice trembling, as though she had forgotten even her own humiliation, and could only care about the woman who had just protected her. Della forced out a reassuring smile. "My mother is in the hospital," she answered quietly, "but I'm fine. Don't worry about me." The two women drew together into a shadowed corner near the exit, temporarily escaping the center of attention as the crowd began murmuring among themselves. And in that brief moment, between two strangers who had just endured humiliation side by side, a strange closeness began to bloom. Sienna lowered her eyes to the swan brooch in her palm, her fingers lightly stroking the tarnished silver wings. "That name, Damon," she suddenly said, her voice so small that only Della could hear it. "He's my brother." Della lifted her head slightly, but didn't ask anything. She only waited in silence, because she understood that some secrets needed to be told at the pace of the person carrying them. "He doesn't know I'm here tonight," Sienna continued, her eyes still fixed on the brooch. "I hid it from him. I earned this internship on my own. I sent in my application without using my real last name, without asking anyone for help. I wanted them to accept me because of what I could do, not because I'm someone's sister." The girl raised her head, her eyes shining with tears, yet lit by a stubborn pride. "My whole life, I've lived in my brother's shadow. Everywhere I go, people only see me as his little tail. No one has ever really seen me, seen what I can create. I just wanted one time, only once, to stand on my own 2 feet." Della looked at the girl, and deep compassion rose inside her, because she understood better than anyone the longing to be seen as a whole person, not through some label already pasted onto her. "You did the right thing," Della said softly, placing her hand over the girl's hand that was holding the brooch. "A person brave enough to walk on her own feet is someone worth being proud of, no matter how rough the road may be. Don't ever let people like them make you think your worth lies in your family name or in the clothes you're wearing." Sienna looked at her, her lips trembling, and then the girl did something that surprised even Della. She leaned into the arms of that strange woman and began to cry, not with the sound of humiliation from when she had been shoved to the floor, but with the tears of someone who had just found a place of shelter in the middle of a storm. Della wrapped her arms around the girl, soothing that trembling back, and in that moment, 2 people who seemed to have nothing to do with each other. One the sister of one of the most powerful men in Chicago, the other the woman who had once saved that very powerful man on a rainy night without ever knowing it, found in each other a refuge that no one in that glittering hall could have given them. They didn't know that destiny had quietly bound their fates together 6 years earlier, and that, in only a few more minutes, that invisible thread would reveal itself before everyone's eyes in a way no one could have imagined. The 2 women had not yet managed to steady themselves after that brief moment of refuge when the phone in Della's pocket vibrated once again, and this time, the name St. Mercy Hospital appearing on the screen made her heart feel as though it had dropped straight into a cold abyss. She hurriedly pressed the phone to her ear, and the voice on the other end, no longer gentle with information this time, but urgent and strained, told her that her mother's condition had become critical within the past hour, that the doctors needed to perform an intervention immediately if they wanted to save her life, and that in order to begin, the family needed to complete the remaining hospital payment tonight. The amount they had just mentioned was so large that it made Della dizzy, larger than anything she could gather, even if she worked herself to the bone for many more months. The phone nearly slipped from her hand, which had suddenly lost all strength, and she had to lean quickly against the cold wall behind her to keep from collapsing. The whole world around her blurred in an instant, the gentle music, the laughter and voices, the glittering crystal lights, all of it seemed to retreat behind a pane of fogged glass, leaving only her and the despair rising up to her throat. Her only mother was lying on the line between life and death just a few streets away, and she, the daughter that woman had spent her whole life loving, was standing here helpless, without even enough money to save her. The cruel contradiction of life struck her more painfully than any insult that crowd could throw, because in this room overflowing with wealth, where a single watch on a guest's wrist could pay her mother's hospital bill many times over, she couldn't touch even $1 of it. Sienna realized at once that something was terribly wrong, and the girl hurried to support Della when she saw the woman sway. "What's wrong?" she asked in panic, but Della couldn't answer. Her throat had closed tight, her lips trembling without being able to form a word. She only shook her head, trying to breathe, trying to keep herself from crumpling right there in front of everyone, because even in that darkest moment, the dignity that had followed her all her life still wouldn't allow her to fall before those who were waiting to see her fall. 2 tears finally rolled down her cheeks, not because of the insults, not because she had been shoved or mocked, but because of the deep helplessness of a daughter who couldn't save her own mother. She thought of her mother's gentle face, of those cloudy eyes that still brightened whenever she stepped into the hospital room, of the words her mother still whispered, that she only wished she could get well again so she could help her daughter. And Della's heart clenched so tightly she felt as though she couldn't breathe. For how many years had she forced herself to keep going? How many years had she bowed her head and endured? How many years had she believed that as long as she was strong enough, hardworking enough, and decent enough, life would one day show mercy? And yet now, standing in the darkest moment of all, she began to doubt everything. Perhaps kindness truly meant nothing. Perhaps goodness was only a luxury that poor people like her had no right to keep. Della squeezed her eyes shut and leaned fully against the wall. And for the first time in that long, endless night, the woman who had stood like a lighthouse in the storm felt the flame inside her about to go out. But she had no idea that at that very darkest second, at the far end of the hall, the grand doors of the Ravenwood Hotel were slowly opening. The music was still flowing gently when, all at once, the pianist in the corner of the room froze midway through a note. And that sudden silence spread through the hall, faster than any announcement could have. Every head turned at once toward the great doors that had just opened, and in that instant, it seemed as though all the onlookers in the room held their breath together. A man stepped inside, his stride unhurried, not rushed, each footstep landing on the marble floor with steady clarity amid the thickening silence. He didn't need to speak. He didn't need to raise a hand in command. His presence alone was enough to make the powerful crowd that had been laughing noisily only moments earlier part on both sides, clearing a path as if water were splitting before the prow of a ship. Those who had so gleefully held up their phones to record just moments before now hurriedly shoved them into their pockets. Faces that had been arrogant a moment ago lowered and turned away, and an invisible feeling of reverence and fear slipped into every corner of the room. People whispered, but in hushed tones filled with caution, and a few leaned toward one another to murmur the name the entire city spoke with dread. It's him. It's Damon Westcott. Across the hall, Roland Vandermeer had just managed to come down from upstairs, and when his eyes landed on the figure of the man who had just entered, the wineglass in his hand suddenly tilted, sending a few dark red drops spilling onto the stone floor without him even noticing. Roland's already anxious face visibly went pale, because this wasn't how tonight's meeting was supposed to happen. That powerful man was supposed to be received formally by him in the private stateroom upstairs, not walk down into the crowded hall on his own, earlier than expected. With an icy expression no one could read. Something was wrong. Roland felt it in every fiber of his body, and he hurriedly straightened his tie, forced a courteous smile onto his face, and strode toward Damon, sweat beading on his forehead. "Mr. Westcott," Roland said, his voice trying to sound welcoming but unable to hide its tremor. "It's an honor to have you come down in person. Everything for the signing ceremony is ready. Please, this way." But Damon Westcott didn't seem to hear a word he said. The man's gaze didn't stop on Roland, didn't pass over the file or the lavish banquet tables, but swept slowly across the room with a strange intensity, as if he were searching for something or someone. The entire hall remained submerged in silence, and within that silence, everyone could clearly feel the tension rising second by second, because no one could understand why a man with such power would enter a party looking like someone following a trail. Priscilla, standing not far away, had also lost the triumphant curve of her lips. She looked at her husband lowering himself before that unfamiliar man, and for the first time that night, a vague unease began to kindle inside her. And in the shadowed corner near the exit, Della was still leaning against the wall, her eyes blurred with tears from the terrible news from the hospital, completely unaware of the disturbance unfolding behind her, unaware that the man who had just entered was following an invisible thread stretching back across 6 years, and that the thread was about to lead him straight to her. Damon Westcott began to move, and every step he took made the crowd draw back a little farther, opening a straight path toward the far end of the hall. He walked past the people who had been laughing with such delight only moments earlier, past the woman who had mocked Sienna's phone call, past the group of young women who had been filming while whispering their poisonous little words, and beneath his ice-cold gaze, every one of them lowered their faces, not a single person daring to raise their head and look directly at him. Roland still trailed behind him, his mouth still stammering invitations about the signing ceremony, but Damon didn't answer a single word. His eyes remained fixed straight ahead, where a small figure was tucked away in the shadowed corner, and then he stopped. Right in the middle of the path, his gaze dropped to the marble floor, where a tiny object lay glittering beneath the crystal lights. It was the swan brooch that had fallen to the ground once again when Sienna had panicked and reached out to steady Della. The most powerful man in Chicago, the man before whom the entire room had just bowed in fear, silently bent down in front of everyone and picked up that small brooch with a tenderness that left every witness stunned. He lifted it to eye level, gazing at the tarnished silver wings of the swan, and in that moment, the frost on his face seemed to melt away, revealing a deep, hidden tenderness no one had ever imagined a man like him could carry inside. Then he raised his head, walked straight toward Sienna, and when the girl realized who was approaching her, her eyes widened in shock, and her lips began to tremble uncontrollably. Damon didn't say a word. He only gently lifted the front of his sister's uniform, and with hands accustomed to making cold decisions that could bring an entire corporation crashing down, he carefully pinned the swan brooch back onto her chest, straight and reverent, as though he were putting a broken piece of his own heart back into place. That gesture, silent yet unbearably powerful, said everything that thousands upon thousands of words could not express. "Brother," Sienna cried out in a choked voice, and then everything she had been holding back shattered. She threw herself into the man's arms, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "You came. You really came." Damon wrapped his arms around his sister, his hand stroking her hair with aching gentleness, and for the first time since he had entered, his voice sounded deep and quiet, just loud enough for only her to hear. "I'm sorry, I came late. I let you endure all of this." The entire hall went deathly still. Astonished whispers began spreading like an underground current, and people looked at one another with faces growing paler by the second, because the truth just laid bare before their eyes was so horrifying that no one dared believe what they had heard. The poor little serving girl they had just shoved to the floor, mocked, called trash, and demanded be thrown out, the girl they had been so certain was a lying intruder, had turned out to be Damon Westcott's own sister, the sister of the most powerful man standing in that room. The name Damon that had appeared on her phone screen earlier, the name they had laughed at and dismissed as made up, had been real. So real that the whole room now held not a single sound except the sobbing of the girl in her brother's arms. Priscilla stood rooted to the spot, her face turning from deathly white to ashen gray, and she felt as though the ground beneath her feet were splitting open. But even that horrifying moment was still not the worst thing waiting for the Vandermeer family tonight, because Damon Westcott, after gently wiping away the tears on his sister's cheeks, slowly turned his head, and this time, his gaze came to rest on the serving woman, standing silently beside her. Della was still stunned by the scene that had just unfolded, still unable to fully grasp what it meant that the girl she had protected all night was the sister of that powerful man. When she suddenly realized he was looking at her, and that gaze made her freeze. It wasn't the cold, assessing look he had cast over the entire room earlier, nor was it the tenderness he had given his sister. It was something strange, both doubtful and trembling, like the look of a man who had just glimpsed a figure he thought had been lost forever in the fog of memory. Damon walked slowly toward her, one step at a time, and the closer he came, the more clearly his face revealed a shock he couldn't suppress. He stopped in front of Della, his eyes never leaving her face, studying every line as though comparing it to a blurred portrait he had kept buried deep in his heart for years. Della, bewildered, stepped back once. She didn't understand why this man was looking at her that way, and in her confusion, she lightly lifted one hand to hold her own arm in an old familiar habit, the defensive gesture she always made whenever she felt uneasy. It was that small gesture that made Damon go utterly still, his breath catching in his chest because he had seen it before, had seen those hands, that posture, on a rainy night 6 years ago. Then, before the astonished eyes of the entire hall, the most powerful man in Chicago reached up to his collar and slowly drew out something he had always kept hidden beneath his expensive suit jacket, pressed close to his heart through all those years. It was a silver necklace, darkened by time, with a tiny teardrop pendant swaying softly beneath the crystal lights. When Della saw it, her whole body seemed to freeze. Her eyes widened, her hand rose to cover her mouth, and the tears that had already been gathering, because of the terrible news about her mother, now poured down for an entirely different reason. She recognized that necklace, recognized it from the very first glance, because how could she ever forget the last keepsake of her late father, the thing she had pressed into the hand of a strange man on that rainy night long ago, the thing she had believed she would never see again in her life. "It was you," Della whispered, her voice breaking into pieces. "The man from that rainy night, it was you." And when she lifted her eyes to look at his face again, this time not through the dim darkness of that alley years ago, but in the brilliant light of the hall, she suddenly recognized a faint scar near his eyebrow, the mark left by the wound her own clumsy hands had once bandaged. All the scattered pieces of memory suddenly locked into place in her mind, and she understood that destiny had brought the two of them back together after all those years in a way no imagination could ever have drawn. Damon nodded faintly, and in his eyes, which had always been so cold, there now shimmered something the entire city had never seen before. Tears. "I've been looking for you for 6 years," he said quietly, his deep voice rough with emotion, so low that only she could hear him amid the silence covering the hall. "The diner had closed. No one knew where you'd gone. I thought I'd never have the chance to say thank you." Two people stood facing each other in the middle of a silent sea of onlookers, one the powerful man all Chicago feared, the other the poor serving woman this very room had trampled underfoot. And yet, in that moment, the distance between rich and poor, high and low, vanished completely. All that remained were two hearts connected by a single act of kindness on a rainy night 6 years before. And then Damon slowly turned to face the entire hall, his face returning to its familiar coldness. But this time, hidden inside that coldness was a fury waiting to erupt. Damon Westcott's voice rang through the hall, not loud, but every word was so clear and so icy sharp that it pierced straight into the ears of every person standing there. "Tonight," he said, his gaze slowly sweeping once around the room, "I walked in here and witnessed 200 people, the so-called elite of this city, surrounding a woman, laughing at her, pushing her down, calling her trash, and demanding that she be thrown out like something worthless." He paused for a beat, letting that heavy silence sink deep into each of them, then continued. "Do you know who the woman you just trampled is? 6 years ago, when I collapsed in the middle of a rainy night, when I had nothing left in my hands but wounds, and the people hunting me behind my back, when this entire world had turned away from me, she, a poor serving girl whom you all just looked down on, was the only one who reached out and saved me. She didn't ask who I was. She didn't need to know what position I held or how much money I had. She simply saved a human being standing on the edge of death, and then gave away the last precious thing she owned." Damon's voice dropped lower, carrying a weight that forced the whole room to lower its head. "Without the kindness of the woman you just called trash, the man all of you are bowing and scraping to welcome tonight, the man all of you are hoping to do business with, would no longer exist in this world to stand here before you." That declaration struck the hall like a clap of thunder, and the crowd's response was absolute silence. The silence of people who had just realized they had made a mistake so terrible that no words were left to defend themselves. The faces that had been arrogant moments earlier flushed red with shame, and the people who had so eagerly raised their phones to record now wished there were a crack in the floor beneath their feet that they could crawl into. Priscilla Vandermeer, the woman who had never once in her life accepted being beneath anyone, now stood rooted to the spot, her lips moving without a sound. For the first time, that sharp tongue that had always poured out cruel words was completely paralyzed, because she understood that no apology, no excuse could wash away what she had just done in front of the very man upon whom her entire family had wagered its future. As for Roland, standing not far from his wife, his face had shifted from pale to the ash gray of despair. He didn't need Damon to say another word, because the way that man looked at his wife and son, the cold anger hidden behind every sentence, was enough for him to understand that the deal he had traded his whole career to pursue, the deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars, that could have lifted the Vandermeer family to its peak, had now vanished like smoke before his eyes. The thick file waiting upstairs for a signature had suddenly become meaningless, worthless, nothing more than a stack of scrap paper. "Mr. Westcott," Roland stammered, stepping forward with desperate pleading in his eyes. "Please hear me out. My wife didn't know. She didn't mean it. This is only a misunderstanding." But Damon only slowly turned his head and looked at him, and that ice-cold gaze made Roland's begging die in his throat. The entire hall held its breath and waited, because everyone could feel that the true fury of this powerful man had not yet fallen, and that the price the Vandermeer family would have to pay for tonight had only just begun. Damon Westcott didn't raise his voice. didn't make even a single threatening gesture. He only silently took his phone from the pocket of his suit jacket, and that calm movement made Roland Vandermeer tremble even more than a shout would have. He dialed a familiar number, lifted the phone to his ear, and when he spoke, his voice remained even and cold, as though he were discussing the weather rather than deciding the fate of an entire family. "Call legal," he said into the phone. "The merger with the Vandermeer Group. Cancel it completely, tonight. Pull every piece of capital our fund has put into their projects, and inform every partner in our network that from this moment on, the Vandermeer name is no longer on the list of people we do business with." Every word he spoke fell into the hall like an invisible blade, and Roland could hear his future collapsing in each sentence. He staggered and had to grab the edge of a nearby table to keep from falling, because he understood better than anyone what that meant. Once Damon Westcott withdrew his capital and turned his back, the entire financial world of Chicago would immediately turn away with him. The doors that had once stood wide open to the Vandermeer family would slam shut all at once. The partners who had once fawned and flattered would vanish overnight, and the empire his family had built over generations would begin to crack from its very foundation. "Please," Roland nearly sank to his knees, his voice breaking in despair. "I'll do anything you want. Please don't do this. My whole family will be ruined." But Damon only looked at him with eyes that didn't waver in the slightest. "Mr. Vandermeer," he said, "do you know what disgusts me most about people like your family? It isn't wealth, because money itself has no sin. It's the way you use that wealth to trample people who can't fight back, the way you believe an expensive suit gives you the right to treat other human beings like garbage. Your wife humiliated my sister. She trampled on the woman who saved my life, in front of an entire crowd, and she did it not because of a misunderstanding, but because she believed those people were too lowly to bring her any consequences. Today I want her, and I want every one of you standing here, to understand one thing, that a person's dignity doesn't lie in the balance of their bank account, and that the way you treat those weaker than yourselves is the true measure of your worth." He turned to look at the deathly silent crowd, his voice ringing with authority. "Everything that happened here tonight, every insult, every contemptuous stare, has been recorded, and not only by all of you, but by the security cameras of this hotel, where my fund happens to be the largest shareholder." Those words made Bryce, who had been happily filming for views from the beginning, suddenly turn pale and drop the phone from his hand, because he suddenly understood that the weapon he had used to humiliate others had now turned back and pointed straight at him and his entire family. Priscilla stood there, the powerful woman who had once believed the whole world should kneel at her feet, now feeling every layer of power and prestige she had spent her life building fall away around her like withered petals. And for the first time in her life, she tasted the helplessness she had sown in countless other people. The night Priscilla Vandermeer had believed would be the most glorious evening of her social career turned out to be the night that marked the beginning of her entire family's downfall. News that the merger had been canceled spread at a dizzying speed, faster than the crowd in the hall could even leave Ravenwood, because in Chicago's financial circles, once Damon Westcott turned his back on someone, that news was no different from a death knell. By the very next morning, the partners who had once competed to invite the Vandermeer family to their parties, who had once lined up for the chance to shake Roland's hand, suddenly fell silent all at once. His calls went unanswered, and the doors that had once stood wide open now closed with chilling finality. The empire that had seemed as solid as bedrock, built by the Vandermeer bloodline over generations, began to crack from its very foundation. Banks tightened their credit lines. Investors hurriedly withdrew, and in only a few short weeks, the Vandermeer name went from being a symbol of power and wealth to a warning people whispered to one another in conference rooms. But the most devastating blow against that family didn't come from Damon Westcott. It came from their own hands. The videos Bryce had so gleefully recorded during the party. The footage showing his entire family trampling on a poor serving woman, originally posted online to chase views and amuse the public, now turned back and pointed straight at them. When the truth about Della and Sienna's identities came to light, when people learned that the woman who had been called trash was the very person who had once saved the life of one of the city's most powerful men, those videos spread with terrifying speed, but this time not to mock the victim, but to condemn the people who had committed the wrong. Every frame Bryce had once been proud of, every insult Priscilla had thrown out with such satisfaction, now became undeniable evidence of the cruelty and arrogance of his family, watched again and again by millions of people who judged them for it. The weapon they had used to humiliate someone else ultimately became the very thing that convicted them, and perhaps that was the bitterest justice fate could arrange. Priscilla Vandermeer. The woman who had once been certain the whole world was born to kneel at her feet, now had to face a reality she had never imagined. The friends who had once surrounded her now avoided her as though avoiding a disease. The invitations that had once poured into her home stopped completely, and whenever she stepped out into the street, she could feel the eyes that recognized her. The looks filled with both contempt and pity, the very kind of look she herself had cast upon countless other people. She sat alone inside the vast mansion that had now become empty and cold, gazing at the luxurious objects surrounding her, and for the first time in her life, she understood that all that wealth couldn't buy back the one thing she had lost in a single night: honor and the respect of others. The price of arrogance, as it turned out, was far higher than anything she had ever imagined, and that lesson came to her too late, when there was no longer any way to save what had been destroyed. The wheel of cause and consequence, silent and unforgiving, had finally closed its circle. While the entire Vandermeer empire was trembling on the edge of collapse, somewhere else in the city, a completely different story was quietly unfolding. That very night, before Della could even fully understand everything that had just happened, Damon Westcott quietly did something he didn't mention to anyone. He made a phone call to St. Mercy Hospital, and with only a few brief words, he paid the entire remaining hospital bill for Margaret Hayes. More than that, he arranged for her to be transferred to the best treatment wing, placed under the care of the finest doctors, and given immediately the intervention that only a few hours earlier had still been a distant dream for her poor daughter. He did all of it in silence, without display, without demanding gratitude, because to him this wasn't a favor being bestowed. It was simply the repayment of a debt of kindness he had carried in his heart for 6 long years. And then, after hours of unbearable tension in the operating room, a miracle came. When the first rays of morning sunlight slipped through the hospital window, Margaret slowly opened her eyes. Della, who had fallen forward beside the hospital bed, her hand still tightly holding her mother's after an entire sleepless night, suddenly felt the thin fingers in her palm move faintly. She jerked her head up at once, and when she met her mother's gentle eyes looking back at her, her heart seemed to burst open. "Mom," she whispered, her voice choking, "you're awake." Margaret looked at her daughter, her dry, cracked lips forming a weak smile that was strangely warm, her trembling hand lifting to stroke Della's hollow, tear-stained face. "My daughter," she said softly, her voice faint but clear, "you look so worn out. You stayed up all night because of me again, didn't you?" Della broke down crying, no longer able to hold herself back, all the hardship, all the humiliation, all the fear she had been carrying for so long now pouring out in her sobs. "Don't worry about me, Mom," she choked out. "You're getting better now. Everything will be all right, I promise you." Margaret watched her daughter cry, and in her clouded eyes shone a boundless love. "I've never worried about you, my dear," she said, each word slow and deeply felt. "All my life, no matter how much loss you've had to suffer, no matter how people have treated you, I've always believed that you are a good person, and I know that a kind heart like yours will finally be repaid by heaven. Your father always said that when he was alive, that kindness is like seeds we plant in the earth. It may take a very long time, but one day they'll surely sprout." Those words made Della cry even harder, because she understood that the kindness she had once given away on that rainy night, the kindness that had cost her so many years of hardship, had finally returned to her at the exact moment she needed it most, in a way she could never have imagined. Just then, the door to the hospital room opened softly, and Sienna stepped in, holding a bright bouquet of fresh flowers in her arms, with Damon following quietly behind her and stopping at the threshold. The girl smiled and came to the bedside, gently placing the flowers on the small table, then taking Margaret's other hand. "Hello, Mom," Sienna said softly, her voice tender, as though speaking to someone in her own family. "Please get well soon, because there are still so many people who love you and are waiting for you." Margaret looked at that unfamiliar yet warmly beloved young girl, then looked toward the man standing by the door. And though she didn't understand everything that had happened, she could still feel that her daughter was no longer fighting life alone. In that hospital room, filled with early morning sunlight, 3 women and 1 man, people whom fate had brought together in the strangest of ways, gathered beside one another, and for the first time after so many long, endless months, Della felt her heart warmed by something money could never buy: love and hope. Many months after that fateful night at the Ravenwood Hotel, when Margaret had recovered and returned home, when Sienna had become a young designer people spoke of for her own talent rather than for her brother's last name, and when Della no longer had to drag herself through 2 shifts every day chasing hospital bills, people still often retold that story as a reminder to everyone. Because the story of Della Hayes wasn't simply the story of a poor woman whose life suddenly changed, but proof of a simple truth that we sometimes forget amid the burdens of everyday life: that kindness given unconditionally, even if it must wait through many years, even if it sometimes costs us losses that seem unfair, will always find its way back in the end to the person who planted it. The young serving woman from years ago saved a stranger on a rainy night without ever hoping to be repaid. She did it only because, in her heart, a human being in pain deserved to be helped, no matter who that person was. And that very selfless heart, after all those years, became the fragile thread that lifted her entire life at the exact moment when she thought she had reached the bottom of despair. This story also leaves each of us with a profound lesson that a person's true worth never lies in the amount of money they have, the clothes they wear, or the position they hold, but in the way they treat those weaker than themselves, those who can't bring them any benefit in return. Because kindness shown to someone who has nothing to repay with is the truest measure of a person's character. May this story remind each of us to pause for a moment before judging someone by appearances, and to know when to reach out a hand to those struggling around us, because we never know what kind of great miracle one small act of kindness today may plant for the future. If the story you just heard has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like, and share this video with your loved ones so that every day we can continue listening together to more meaningful and heartfelt stories. How do you feel about Della's story, about kindness and fate's repayment? Please leave a comment below to share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your voice. Thank you for taking the time to watch until the very final moment. May everyone watching this video always have abundant health, a joyful and peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye for now, and see you again in the next stories.